The telegram arrived on a sweltering afternoon in June of 1876, and Victoria Frances knew before she even opened it that her life was about to shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces. She stood in the doorway of the boarding house where she had been living for the past 3 months, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the thin paper. The words swam before her eyes, but their meaning crashed over her like a wave of ice water despite the oppressive Colorado heat. Her Uncle Silas was coming to Fort Garland. He would arrive within the week to collect her and take her back to Kansas, where he had already made arrangements for her to marry a man 40 years her senior, a business associate who would settle Silas's considerable gambling debts in exchange for a young bride. Victoria was 21 years old, and she had fled to Fort Garland precisely to escape this fate. Her parents had died of influenza the previous winter, leaving her with nothing but a small inheritance that her uncle had immediately seized control of as her legal guardian. She had used the last of her own saved money to buy a train ticket west, hoping to find work and disappear into the vast frontier before Silas could execute his plans. For 3 months, she had worked at the boarding house, serving meals and cleaning rooms, saving every penny and praying that she had run far enough. She had not. Victoria pressed her back against the doorframe, her breath coming in short gasps. The afternoon sun beat down on the dusty main street of Fort Garland, and she could hear the distant sound of hammering from the new church being built at the edge of town. A few riders passed by, their horses kicking up small clouds of dirt. Everything seemed so normal, so peaceful, and yet her entire world was collapsing. "Miss Frances, are you all right?" The voice startled her, and Victoria looked up to find Yates Quinn standing at the bottom of the boarding house steps, his hat in his hands. He was a cowboy who worked at the Triple Diamond Ranch just outside of town, and he came into the boarding house every Sunday for supper. He was perhaps 25, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that was always slightly too long, curling at the nape of his neck. His eyes were a striking gray-blue, like storm clouds over the mountains, and they were currently filled with concern. "I am fine, Mr. Quinn," Victoria managed, but her voice cracked on the words. She tried to fold the telegram and tuck it into her apron pocket, but her hands were shaking too badly. Yates took a step closer, his brow furrowing. "You do not look fine, if you will pardon me saying so. You look like you have seen a ghost." Victoria wanted to brush him off, to retreat into the boarding house and hide in her small room until she could figure out what to do, but something about the genuine worry in his expression made her defenses crumble. Perhaps it was because she had no one else to turn to. Perhaps it was because she was so terrified that she could not bear the weight of it alone for another moment. "My uncle," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "He has found me. He is coming here." Yates's expression darkened. "The uncle you ran from. The one who wanted to sell you off to settle his debts." Victoria blinked in surprise. She had never told anyone in Fort Garland the full story of why she had come west, only that she was seeking a fresh start after her parents' deaths. "How did you know about that?" "You talk in your sleep sometimes," Yates said quietly. "I have heard you through the walls when I stay here on Saturday nights after playing cards with the boys. You have nightmares. You call out, begging someone not to make you marry him." Victoria felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but there was no judgment in Yates's eyes, only sympathy. She had noticed him before, of course. It was impossible not to notice Yates Quinn. He was quiet and respectful, but there was something solid and dependable about him, like the mountains that ringed the valley. He always said please and thank you, and he never drank too much or caused trouble like some of the other cowboys. More than once, she had caught herself watching him during Sunday suppers, admiring the way he listened when people talked, really listened, as though their words mattered to him. "He will be here in less than a week," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "He has the legal right to take me back. I am not yet 25, and the law says he is my guardian until then or until I marry. He will drag me back to Kansas and force me to marry that awful man, and there is nothing I can do to stop him." Yates was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as though he were turning over a difficult problem in his mind. Then he looked at her directly, his storm cloud eyes steady and serious. "There is one thing you can do," he said slowly. "You said he is your guardian until you are 25 or until you marry. Well, you could marry someone else first, someone who would not let him take you anywhere." Victoria stared at him, her heart pounding. "I do not know anyone who would marry me just to keep me safe from my uncle. I have no money to offer, no property, nothing that would make such an arrangement worthwhile for a man." "I would," Yates said simply. The words hung in the air between them, impossible and yet absolutely sincere. Victoria searched his face, looking for signs of mockery or ulterior motives, but found only that same steady seriousness. "You cannot mean that," she whispered. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Yates replied. "I know you work harder than anyone else at this boarding house. I know you are kind to the children who come through here, and you always have a smile for the old folks even when you are bone-tired. I know you deserve better than to be sold off like cattle to pay a gambling man's debts." He took a breath. "And I know I have a little ranch of my own now, just a small place I bought this spring with my savings. It is not much, but it is mine, and there is a house on it. You would be safe there. Your uncle could not touch you if you were my wife." Victoria felt tears spill down her cheeks. "But you do not love me. You do not even know me, not really. Why would you do this?" Something flickered in Yates's eyes, something that looked almost like pain. "Maybe I want to," he said quietly. "Maybe I am tired of being alone out there, and maybe I think you are the kind of woman who could make a house feel like a home. Or maybe I just cannot stand by and watch someone get hurt when I have the power to stop it." He turned his hat over in his hands. "I am not asking for anything you are not willing to give, Miss Francis. We can make it a marriage of convenience if that is what you want. Separate rooms, no expectations. I just want to help." Victoria pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the generosity and the impossibility of what he was offering. Marriage to a stranger to escape her uncle's clutches seemed almost as terrifying as the fate that awaited her in Kansas, and yet when she looked at Yates Quinn, she did not feel afraid. She felt something else entirely, something warm and hopeful that she had not felt in a very long time. "I do not know what to say," she managed. "Say yes," Yates said, and for the first time he smiled. It transformed his whole face, making him look younger and more open. "Say yes, and we will go to the Reverend right now and get this done before your uncle can set foot in Fort Garland. Then let him come. Let him try to take you. He will find out quick enough that you are under my protection now and I do not give up what is mine." Victoria took a shaking breath. It was insane. It was reckless. It was the most impulsive thing she had ever considered in her entire carefully ordered life. And yet, what choice did she have? If she stayed unmarried, Silas would drag her back to Kansas in chains if he had to. If she ran again, he would only find her again eventually. This was her one chance at freedom, even if it came in the most unexpected form imaginable. "Yes," she whispered, and then, more strongly, "Yes, Mr. Quinn, I will marry you." The wedding took place less than 2 hours later in the small church at the edge of town, with the Reverend and his wife serving as witnesses. Victoria wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had belonged to her mother, and Yates wore his cleanest shirt, and a string tie he borrowed from the reverend. The ceremony was brief and businesslike, the words spoken quickly and efficiently, but when Yates slid a plain gold band onto Victoria's finger, his hands were gentle and warm. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the reverend said, beaming at them. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Quinn." Victoria's heart lurched. She had not thought about this part. She looked up at Yates uncertainly, and he leaned down, his eyes asking for permission. She gave the smallest nod, and he brushed his lips against hers so softly she barely felt it, a whisper of a kiss that was over almost before it began. It was her first kiss, and despite its brevity, it sent a strange flutter through her chest. When they stepped out of the church into the golden evening light, Victoria felt as though she were moving through a dream. She was married. To Yates Quinn, a man she had served Sunday supper to for 3 months and barely spoken more than 20 words to beyond taking his order. It was madness. And yet, when Yates offered her his arm and said, "Come on, Mrs. Quinn, let me take you home," she felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. Mrs. Quinn, not Miss Frances anymore, not a ward and piece of property to be traded and sold. Mrs. Quinn, a married woman with rights of her own. Yates had a wagon waiting outside the church, and he helped her up onto the seat before climbing up beside her. The sun was beginning to set over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and as they drove out of Fort Garland toward his ranch, Victoria felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen just slightly. "It is about 5 miles out," Yates said, breaking the silence. "The ranch, I mean. It is not much, just 40 acres and a small house, but the land is good. I run a few head of cattle, and I have been thinking about getting some chickens come fall." "It sounds lovely," Victoria said, and she meant it. After months of living in a cramped room at the boarding house, the idea of open land and a house of her own, even if it was small, sounded like paradise. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creaking of the wagon and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves. Victoria studied Yates from the corner of her eye, trying to reconcile this man who had just married her with the quiet cowboy she had served meals to. He had a strong profile, with a straight nose and a firm jaw, and there were small lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun. His hands on the reins were calloused and capable, the hands of a man who worked hard for everything he had. "Why did you really do this?" Victoria asked suddenly. The question had been burning in her mind since he made his offer. "Please tell me the truth. No one is that selfless." Yates was quiet for so long that Victoria thought he might not answer. Then he sighed, a deep sound that seemed to come from the very center of his chest. "My sister," he said finally. "Her name was Lily. She was married off young to a man who seemed respectable on the surface but turned out to be cruel. She tried to leave him once, but the law sent her right back because she was his wife and his property. He beat her so badly that winter that she lost the baby she was carrying. She died of fever a week later." Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Yates, I am so sorry." "She was 19, Yates continued, his voice rough with old grief. "Just 19 years old, and she died because no one would help her. Because everyone said it was not their business what a man did with his own wife." He turned to look at Victoria, and his eyes were fierce. "I swore after that I would never stand by and watch someone be forced into a situation they did not want. So when I heard you calling out in your nightmares, when I realized what you were running from, I started thinking about how I might be able to help if the opportunity came up. Then today, when I saw you with that telegram, I knew. This was my chance to do what I could not do for Lily." Victoria felt tears streaming down her face. "I am not your sister," she said softly. "No," Yates agreed, "but you deserve to be safe and I can give you that. That is enough for me." They arrived at the ranch just as the last light was fading from the sky. The house was small, just 2 rooms with a loft, but it was solidly built with a covered porch and a stone chimney. There was a barn behind it, and a fenced pasture where Victoria could see several horses and a handful of cattle grazing in the twilight. It was simple and humble, but it was also peaceful, and Victoria felt something tight in her chest loosen another notch. Yates helped her down from the wagon and carried her single bag inside. The main room held a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a rocking chair near the fireplace. The second room was clearly Yates's bedroom, with a narrow bed and a chest of drawers. The loft above was accessed by a ladder and appeared to be used for storage. "You can have the bedroom," Yates said immediately. "I will sleep up in the loft. It is comfortable enough, and that way you will have your privacy." "Yates, this is your home," Victoria protested. "I cannot throw you out of your own bed." "You are not throwing me out of anything," Yates said firmly. "You are my wife now, and I will not have you uncomfortable in your own home." He set her bag down in the bedroom doorway. "I mean what I said earlier, Victoria. I am not expecting anything from you that you are not ready to give. This is a safe place. That is all it has to be for now." Victoria looked at him. This man who had turned his entire life upside down for a woman he barely knew, and felt a wave of gratitude so intense it was almost painful. "Thank you," she whispered. "I do not know how I will ever repay you for this." "You do not owe me anything," Yates said. "Just make yourself at home here. That is all I ask." Over the next few days, Victoria did exactly that. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, unpacked her few belongings, and began to learn the rhythms of ranch life. Yates was up before dawn every morning to tend to the animals, and Victoria learned to have coffee and breakfast ready for him when he came in from the barn. She mended his shirts, cooked his meals, and in the evenings, they would sit on the porch together and watch the sun set over the mountains. They talked during those evening hours, tentative at first, but gradually with more ease. Victoria told him about her childhood in Kansas, about her parents, and the small farm they had run before the influenza took them. Yates told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to ride and rope from his father, about the dream of having his own place that had driven him to save every penny he earned. They discovered shared loves of reading and a good thunderstorm, shared dislikes of overly spicy food and people who talked too much without saying anything of substance. Slowly, carefully, they were becoming friends. On the 5th day after their wedding, Victoria was in the garden behind the house, pulling weeds and trying to coax some life into the neglected vegetable patch, when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Her blood turned to ice. She stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, and saw a dust cloud rising from the direction of the main road. Yates emerged from the barn, his expression alert. He saw the direction of her gaze and immediately crossed to her side. "Go inside," he said quietly. "Lock the door and stay away from the windows." "What if it is him?" Victoria whispered, her voice shaking. "Then I will deal with it," Yates said. His hand rested on the gun at his hip, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked dangerous. "But you are not to come out no matter what you hear, do you understand? You are safe here, and I aim to keep it that way." Victoria wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she would not let him face her uncle alone, but the steel in his eyes stopped her. She nodded and hurried inside, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She went to the bedroom window and peered out through a crack in the curtains, watching as the wagon drew closer. It was a hired wagon from town, and sure enough, there was Silas Francis sitting beside the driver, his heavy face red from the sun and set in lines of fury. He was a big man, tall and broad, with graying hair and cold eyes that had always made Victoria think of a snake. Beside him sat another man, lean and weather-beaten, with a tin star pinned to his vest. The sheriff. Victoria's stomach dropped. Silas had brought the law with him. The wagon pulled to a stop in front of the house, and Silas climbed down, his movements stiff and irritated. The sheriff followed more slowly, his expression neutral. Yates stood in the yard, his feet planted wide and his hand still resting on his gun. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Yates asked, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. "You can start by bringing out my niece," Silas said, his voice booming across the yard. "I know she is here. The woman at the boarding house in town said she left with some cowboy, and the Reverend said that cowboy was you. Victoria Francis, you come out here right now." "There is no Victoria Francis here," Yates said mildly. "Only my wife, Victoria Quinn." Silas's face turned an even darker shade of red. "That is a lie. Victoria is my ward, and she had no permission to marry anyone. That marriage is not legal." The sheriff stepped forward, his hand held up in a placating gesture. "Now, Mr. Francis, if the young lady is of age and married of her own free will, then she is no longer your ward. That is the law." "She is not of age," Silas roared. "She is only 21, and the law says she is under my guardianship, until she is 25 or married with my permission, which she most certainly does not have." "The law says she is under your guardianship until she is 21 or married," the sheriff corrected patiently. "And seeing as she is 21 and married, that means she is no longer your responsibility, Mr. Francis. I am sorry you came all this way, but there is nothing I can do here." Silas's hands clenched into fists. "That is not right. She owes me. Her father owed me money before he died, and she was going to settle that debt by marrying Jacob Marsh. She ran off before she could fulfill her obligation." "A person cannot owe a marriage debt," the sheriff said, his voice hardening slightly. "And a woman is not property to be traded for money. If her father owed you money, then that is an issue for the courts, but it has nothing to do with who the young lady chooses to marry." "She did not choose anything," Silas shouted. "This man took advantage of her, probably filled her head with lies and promises to get her to marry him, so he could get his hands on her inheritance." "What inheritance?" Yates asked coldly. "From what Victoria told me, you seized control of the small amount her parents left her and spent it on gambling and drinking. She came here with nothing but the clothes on her back and a few dollars in her pocket. I married her because I wanted to, not because of any money." Silas's eyes narrowed. "You turned her against me. She was always a good girl, obedient, until you got your hooks into her." "That is enough," the sheriff said sharply. "Mr. Francis, I agreed to accompany you out here to ensure that your niece was safe and not being held against her will. But I can see that this is a legitimate marriage, and unless the young lady tells me otherwise, there is nothing more to be done. You need to accept that she is no longer your ward and move on." "I want to see her," Silas demanded. "I want to hear from her own mouth that she wants to be married to this nobody cowboy." Yates's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Victoria made a decision. She could not let him fight this battle alone, and she could not hide forever. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she unlocked the door and stepped out onto the porch. Silas's eyes locked onto her immediately, and Victoria had to force herself not to retreat back inside. "There you are," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "Victoria, sweetheart, I have been so worried about you. Come on now, we will sort out this mess and get you back home where you belong." "I am home," Victoria said, her voice shaking but determined. She moved to stand beside Yates, and when he offered her his hand, she took it, drawing strength from his solid presence. My home is here with my husband." "That man is not your husband," Silas said, his voice rising again. "You married him without my permission, probably while you were hysterical with fear. It does not count. Now stop being foolish and get in the wagon." "She is not going anywhere with you," Yates said, his hand tightening on Victoria's. "She is my wife, legal and binding, and she is staying right here." Silas took a step forward, his face twisted with rage, but the sheriff moved quickly to block him. "Mr. Francis, you need to calm down. Like I said, this is a legal marriage. The young lady is of age and clearly willing. There is nothing you can do here." "This is not over," Silas said, jabbing a finger at Victoria. "You owe me, girl. Your father took money from me, promised me I would be paid back, and now he is dead and you think you can just run off and leave me with nothing. I will find a way to make you pay one way or another. If you threaten my wife again, we are going to have a problem," Yates said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "A big one. Now I suggest you get back in that wagon and head back to town before this situation gets out of hand." For a long moment, Silas stared at them, his eyes burning with hatred. Then he spat on the ground at their feet and turned away. "This is not finished," he said over his shoulder as he climbed back into the wagon. "Not by a long shot." The sheriff tipped his hat to Yates and Victoria. "I apologize for the disturbance, Mr. and Mrs. Quinn. I do not think he will be back, but if he causes you any trouble, you come find me in town." He glanced at Silas's rigid back. Some folks just cannot accept when things do not go their way. They watched as the wagon turned around and headed back down the road toward Fort Garland, the dust slowly settling in its wake. Victoria did not realize she was shaking until Yates gently pulled her into his arms, and then she collapsed against his chest, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. "It is all right," Yates murmured, his hand stroking her hair. "He is gone. You are safe." "He said it was not over," Victoria whispered into his shirt. "What if he comes back? What if he tries to hurt you to get to me? Then I will deal with it," Yates said firmly. He pulled back slightly so he could look into her eyes. "Victoria, I meant what I said. You are my wife now, and I protect what is mine. He is not going to take you anywhere. I promise you that." Victoria looked up at him, at the fierce determination in his storm cloud eyes, and felt something shift in her chest. This was not just about gratitude anymore, or relief at being rescued from her uncle's plans. This was something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster and her skin feel warm everywhere he touched her. This was the beginning of something that felt dangerously close to love. The days following Silas's visit were tense. Victoria kept expecting him to return with more men or some legal document that would invalidate her marriage. But as 1 week passed and then another, it began to seem as though he had actually given up and returned to Kansas. Slowly, Victoria allowed herself to relax, to believe that she might actually be safe. Life on the ranch fell into a comfortable rhythm. Victoria discovered that she enjoyed the work of running a household, the satisfaction of cooking a good meal, or seeing freshly washed sheets blowing in the breeze. She started rebuilding the vegetable garden, planting beans and squash and carrots, and she loved the feeling of dirt under her fingernails and sun on her face. Yates taught her how to ride his gentlest mare, and in the evenings, they would sometimes ride out together to check the fence lines or just to watch the sunset from the hills above the ranch. They were getting closer, their friendship deepening with each passing day. Victoria found herself watching for him to come in from the fields, found herself listening for the sound of his voice and his footsteps on the porch. She loved the way he looked when he laughed, his whole face lighting up, and the way he always asked her opinion on ranch decisions as though her thoughts truly mattered to him. She loved the gentleness in his hands when he helped her down from her horse, and the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her across the dinner table. She was falling in love with her husband, and she had no idea if he felt the same way. One evening in late July, they were sitting on the porch after supper, watching lightning flicker in the clouds over the mountains. The air was thick and heavy with the promise of rain, and Victoria could smell the dust and sage carried on the wind. Yates was sitting in the rocking chair and Victoria was perched on the porch railing, her bare feet dangling. "Storm is coming," Yates said, his eyes on the distant lightning. "We could use the rain. It has been too dry this summer." "I love thunderstorms," Victoria said. "I always have, ever since I was little. My mother used to say I was strange for not being afraid of them." "You are not strange," Yates said, glancing over at her with a smile. "You are just unusual, in a good way." Victoria felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "You think I am unusual?" "I think you are a lot of things," Yates said quietly. "Unusual is just one of them." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "Victoria, can I ask you something, of course? Are you happy here?" The question was soft, almost hesitant, as though he was afraid of the answer. "I know this is not the life you probably imagined for yourself, married to a stranger and living on a small ranch in the middle of nowhere. If you are not happy, if you want something different, I need you to tell me. I do not want you to feel trapped here." Victoria stared at him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "Yates, I am happier here than I have been in years," she said honestly. "Maybe happier than I have ever been. This place, this life, it is more than I ever dreamed of having." Yates stood up from the rocking chair and moved to stand in front of her, his hands coming to rest on the railing on either side of her. He was so close that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his gray eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You mean that?" he asked, his voice rough. "I mean it," Victoria whispered. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Yates, I need to tell you something. I know we got married so you could keep me safe from my uncle, and I know you said it could just be a marriage of convenience, but I do not want that anymore. I do not want separate rooms and a polite friendship. I want a real marriage. With you." For a moment, Yates just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "Victoria, I have been in love with you since the second Sunday you served me supper at that boarding house," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "You smiled at me and asked how my week had been, and I knew right then that you were the one I had been waiting for. I married you to keep you safe, yes, but I also married you because I could not stand the thought of any other man having the right to call you his wife. I wanted that right, I wanted you." Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes. "You love me," she whispered. "I love you," Yates confirmed. "I have loved you for months, and I will love you until the day I die if you will let me." "Yes," Victoria breathed, and then his mouth was on hers, and she was kissing him back with all the pent-up longing and emotion of the past weeks. This was nothing like the chaste brush of lips at their wedding. This was deep and hungry and full of promise, a claiming and a surrendering all at once. Victoria wound her arms around his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair, and Yates's hands slid down to her waist, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the first drops of rain were beginning to fall, spattering against the porch roof and the dusty ground beyond. Yates rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Come inside," he murmured. "Come to bed with me, Victoria. As my wife, truly and completely." "Yes," Victoria said again, and let him take her hand and lead her into the house. The next morning, Victoria woke in Yates's arms in the big bed, the sun streaming through the window and the sound of birds singing outside. She felt different, changed in some fundamental way, and when Yates opened his eyes and smiled at her with such tenderness it made her chest ache, she knew that she had found exactly what she had been searching for without even knowing she was looking. She had found home. She had found love. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened and blossomed. They moved through their days as true partners now, working side by side on the ranch and falling into bed together each night, learning each other's bodies and hearts with equal passion. Yates was an attentive and generous lover, patient with her inexperience, and always making sure she felt cherished and desired. Victoria had never imagined that marriage could be like this, that physical intimacy could be so wonderful. And she thanked God every day that Yates Quinn had been standing outside the boarding house on the day that telegram arrived. In late August, Victoria realized that her monthly courses had not come. At first, she thought it was just stress or the change in her life, but when another week passed and then another, she began to suspect the truth. She was carrying Yates's child. She waited to tell him until she was certain, until the morning sickness started and she could no longer deny what was happening. She was terrified of how he would react. They had been married for barely 3 months, and she knew they had not discussed children. What if he was not ready? What if he thought it was too soon? But when she finally worked up the courage to tell him one evening after supper, his reaction swept away all her fears. His face went blank with shock for just a moment, and then he let out a whoop of joy so loud, it startled the horses in the barn. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing and kissing her face all over until she was laughing too, tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks. "A baby," he kept saying, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Victoria asked, even though the answer was written all over his face. "Happy." Yates set her down carefully, his hands immediately going to her still flat stomach. "Victoria, I am the happiest man alive. You have given me everything. A home, a family, a reason to wake up smiling every single morning. I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "I love you too," Victoria said and kissed him, long and slow and deep. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Victoria continued to work around the ranch as long as she was able, and when she finally had to slow down, Yates hired a young man named Tom from town to help with the heavier chores. He fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more and eat more and not lift anything heavier than a teacup. Victoria found his overprotectiveness both exasperating and endearing, and she loved him all the more for it. In November, Victoria received a letter from Kansas. She almost did not open it, afraid it was from Sela's, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside, she found a brief note from a lawyer informing her that Sela's Francis had died of a heart attack in September. He had no will and no heirs other than Victoria, and there were some minor debts to settle, but after that, a small amount of money would be coming to her. Victoria read the letter twice, trying to process how she felt. Relief, certainly, that the threat of Sela's was gone forever, but also a strange sadness for the man her uncle could have been if he had not let greed and bitterness consume him. She showed the letter to Yates that evening, and he held her while she cried for reasons she could not quite articulate. "It is over," he said softly, stroking her hair. "He cannot hurt you anymore. You are free, Victoria, truly free." And she was. The fear that had been a constant companion for so long finally lifted, and Victoria felt lighter than air. She was safe. She was loved. She was free. Their son was born on a cold February morning in 1877, after a labor that lasted most of the night and left Victoria exhausted but exhilarated. Yates had stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. And when the midwife finally placed the squalling, red-faced baby in his arms, The look of pure awe on his face made everything Victoria had just been through worth it. "We made this," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Victoria, we made a whole person." "What should we name him?" Victoria asked, reaching out to stroke the baby's downy head. "What about James?" Yates suggested. "After your father." Victoria felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. Her father's name had been James, and she loved that Yates wanted to honor him. "James Quinn," she said softly. "It is perfect." As little James grew, the ranch grew too. Yates bought more cattle with the money from Silas's estate, and he built a new barn and expanded the house, adding another bedroom and a proper parlor. Victoria turned the vegetable garden into a thriving enterprise, selling produce to the boarding house in town and to several other families in the area. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. When James was 2 years old, Victoria found herself pregnant again. This time, she was not nervous about telling Yates. She simply whispered the news to him one night in bed, and he pulled her close and kissed her forehead, his hand splaying protectively across her stomach. "Another one," he murmured. "We are going to have our hands full." "Are you complaining?" Victoria teased. "Not even a little bit," Yates said, and kissed her until she forgot what they had been talking about. Their daughter was born in October of 1879, a tiny thing with dark hair and her father's gray-blue eyes. They named her Eleanor, after Yates's mother, and she was the light of her father's life from the moment she drew her first breath. Yates, who had always been gentle and patient with James, became utterly besotted with his daughter, carrying her everywhere and singing to her in a low, rumbling voice that never failed to make her giggle. The years passed in a blur of hard work and deep contentment. James grew into a sturdy boy who loved horses and following his father around the ranch. And Eleanor was a bright, curious child who asked endless questions and wanted to help with everything. Victoria and Yates's love for each other only deepened with time, the initial passion settling into something even more powerful, a bone-deep partnership and devotion that sustained them through good times and bad. When James was 10 and Eleanor was 7, they had one more child, another daughter they named Sarah. She was the surprise of their lives, arriving when Victoria thought her childbearing years were behind her. But she was also a blessing, sweet-tempered and affectionate in a way that completed their family perfectly. On a warm evening in May of 1889, Victoria and Yates sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching their 3 children play in the yard. James was teaching Eleanor how to rope a fence post, and little Sarah was chasing butterflies through the long grass, her laughter ringing out clear and bright. The house behind them was full of love and life, and the land around them was green and prosperous. "You ever think about that day I asked you to marry me?" Yates asked, reaching over to take Victoria's hand. "All the time," Victoria said, smiling at him. "I think about how terrified I was and how brave you were, and how lucky I am that you were standing outside that boarding house at exactly the right moment." "I do not think it was luck," Yates said thoughtfully. "I think it was meant to be. You were meant to come to Fort Garland, and I was meant to be there to meet you, and we were meant to build this life together." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "I would do it all again in a heartbeat, Victoria, every single moment." "Even the part where my uncle showed up and threatened you?" Victoria asked with a smile. "Even that," Yates confirmed. "Because it brought us to here to this, and I would not trade this for anything in the world." Victoria leaned over and kissed him, slow and sweet, pouring 13 years of love and gratitude into it. When she pulled back, she rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching their children and the sun setting over the mountains. She had run to Colorado in fear, fleeing a fate she could not accept, and she had found something infinitely better than mere safety. She had found love, real and true and lasting. She had found a partner who saw her not as property or a burden, but as an equal, someone whose thoughts and dreams mattered. She had found a home, not just in the physical sense, but in the deepest sense, a place where she belonged utterly and completely. And it had all started with a telegram, a terrified girl, and a cowboy brave enough to offer her his name and his protection without asking for anything in return. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Yates pulled Victoria closer and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you, Mrs. Quinn," he murmured. "I love you too, Mr. Quinn," Victoria whispered back, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Their story had begun with fear and desperation, but it had transformed into something beautiful, a love story written in the dust and sun and wide open spaces of the Colorado frontier. Victoria had come west looking for escape, and found instead the greatest treasure of all, a love that would last the rest of her days and beyond. The children's laughter continued to echo across the ranch as night fell, and inside the warm glow of the house, Victoria and Yates held hands and watched their family with hearts full of joy and gratitude. They had fought for this happiness, had chosen each other when they barely knew one another, and had built something strong and true from that leap of faith. Years later, when James was grown and preparing to take over the ranch, he would ask his parents how they had known they were meant for each other when they got married so quickly. Victoria and Yates would exchange a look, the kind of look that only comes from decades of love and understanding, and Yates would say simply, "Sometimes you just know." Sometimes you meet someone and you realize that you would do anything to keep them safe, to keep them in your life, and that feeling does not go away. It just gets stronger. And Victoria would add, with tears in her eyes, "Your father saved me in every way a person can be saved. He gave me freedom and safety and love when I had nothing and no one. He married me to protect me, but he loved me because of who I am, and that made all the difference." On that May evening in 1889, as they sat on their porch watching their children play, Victoria and Yates could not know all the years that still lay ahead of them. They could not know about the droughts and the hard winters, the losses and the triumphs, the grandchildren who would someday play in that same yard. But they knew the most important thing. They knew that whatever came, they would face it together, bound by a love that had been forged in desperation and refined by time into something unbreakable. The ranch would continue to prosper, growing into one of the most respected operations in the Fort Garland area. James would indeed take over when Yates grew older, and he would run it with the same integrity and care his father had taught him. Eleanor would marry a kind man from town and give Victoria and Yates 4 beautiful grandchildren. Sarah would become a teacher, educating the children of Fort Garland and the surrounding ranches, carrying on her mother's love of learning and reading. But all of that was still to come. For now, on this perfect evening, Victoria and Yates simply sat together, their hands intertwined, their hearts full, watching the light fade from the sky and feeling the deep satisfaction of a life well lived and a love well earned. "Thank you," Victoria said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "For what?" Yates asked, turning to look at her. "For everything," Victoria said simply. "For being brave enough to offer me your name when I had nowhere else to turn. For loving me when I was too scared to believe I deserved to be loved. For giving me this life, these children, this home. For being the best man I have ever known." Yates's eyes grew bright with emotion. "You do not need to thank me for any of that, Victoria. Loving you has been the easiest thing I have ever done. You are my heart, my home, my everything. If I have given you anything, it is only a fraction of what you have given me." They kissed again, long and tender, and when they pulled apart, both were smiling through tears. The children had come closer to the porch now, and James called out asking if he could show his parents the new trick he had taught his horse. Victoria and Yates stood up, still holding hands, and walked down the porch steps together to admire their son's accomplishment. The moon rose over the mountains, full and bright, casting silver light across the ranch. The cattle lowed softly in the pasture, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. The air smelled of sage and pine and the good, clean earth, and Victoria breathed it in deeply, committing this moment to memory. This was what happiness looked like. This was what love built. Not grand gestures or sweeping romance, though there had been plenty of both in their years together. But this, the quiet, everyday moments of life lived side by side with someone who knew you completely and loved you anyway. The shared work and shared laughter, the inside jokes and the comfortable silences, the way Yates still looked at her sometimes as though she was the most amazing thing he had ever seen, the way her heart still skipped a beat when he smiled. As the years continued to unfold, Victoria and Yates grew old together, their hair turning gray and their bodies slowing down, but their love never diminishing. They remained each other's best friend, each other's greatest support, each other's true partner in every sense of the word. When Yates's back started to ache from decades of hard ranch work, Victoria would rub liniment into the sore muscles every evening. When Victoria's eyes grew too tired for reading in dim light, Yates would read to her by the fire, his voice still as warm and comforting as it had been on their wedding day. They never forgot how they had come together, the fear and uncertainty that had driven Victoria into Yates's arms, and the courage and compassion that had led him to offer her his protection. That story became a treasured part of their family history, told and retold to children and grandchildren, as an example of how love can grow from the most unexpected beginnings. How sometimes the best things in life come from taking a chance on someone, from being brave enough to say yes when every logical part of your brain is screaming no. In the summer of 1910, when Victoria was 55 and Yates was nearly 60, they celebrated their 34th wedding anniversary with their entire family gathered at the ranch. There were children and grandchildren everywhere, filling the house and spilling out into the yard. And as Victoria looked around at all the faces she loved, all the lives that existed because she and Yates had taken that leap of faith so many years ago, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That night, after everyone had left or gone to bed, Victoria and Yates sat in their old familiar spot on the porch, wrapped in a blanket together against the cool mountain air. The ranch was quiet now, peaceful, and the stars overhead were brilliant in the clear night sky. 34 years, Yates said softly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together. I know what you mean, Victoria said, snuggling closer to his warmth. I cannot really remember what my life was like before you anymore. You have been the constant, the foundation that everything else is built on. You are mine too, Yates said, his arm tightening around her. My everything. From the moment I saw you standing on those boarding house steps looking like your world was ending, to right now, to every moment still to come. I will love you forever, Victoria Quinn. Even death would not stop me. Do not talk about death, Victoria said, a hint of fear creeping into her voice. Not tonight. Tonight is for celebrating. You are right, Yates agreed. Tonight is for celebrating 34 years of the best decision I ever made. He tilted her face up to his and kissed her. And even after all these years, after thousands of kisses, Victoria still felt that flutter in her chest, that warmth spreading through her body, that certainty that this was exactly where she belonged. They would have many more years together, though not as many as either of them would have liked. Yates would pass away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, with Victoria holding his hand and whispering that she loved him. Victoria would follow him 6 years later, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, her last words a smile and a whisper of his name. But on that anniversary night in 1910, they could not know any of that. They only knew that they had found each other against all odds, had built a life together that was rich in every way that mattered, and that their love had not only survived but thrived through decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and hardship. As they sat on the porch under the stars, holding each other close, Victoria thought back to that terrified girl who had opened a telegram and felt her world collapse. She thought about the cowboy who had offered her a way out, asking for nothing in return. She thought about the wedding in the little church, the fear of facing her uncle, the gradual flowering of friendship into love, the children and the ranch and the 1,000 small moments that had woven together into the tapestry of their marriage. It had not been easy. There had been lean years and crop failures, illnesses and injuries, the heartbreak of losing Yates's father, and then Victoria's distant cousins in Kansas, the worry that came with raising children in a harsh and unforgiving land. But through it all they had had each other, and that had made every hardship bearable, every joy sweeter. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked, sensing her mood. "Everything," Victoria said honestly. "Our whole life together, how grateful I am, how much I love you." "I love you too," Yates said, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, listening to the night sounds and feeling the peace of their long partnership settle around them like a favorite old quilt. Eventually, they went inside to their bed, the same bed where they had first come together as husband and wife in every sense, the bed where their children had been born, the bed where they had weathered fevers and nightmares and whispered conversations in the dark. They made love slowly and tenderly, their bodies knowing each other so well that words were unnecessary, and afterward they fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, content and complete. The ranch would eventually pass fully to James, and then to his son, Victoria and Yates's grandson. The house would be added onto and updated, but the original rooms would remain, a testament to the couple who had built their life there. The story of how Victoria and Yates met and married would become part of local legend, told in the saloons and general stores of Fort Garland as an example of true love and frontier courage. But the real legacy Victoria and Yates left behind was not in the land or the buildings, or even the stories. It was in the descendants who carried their blood and their values, in the understanding that love is not just a feeling but a choice, a commitment, an action taken every single day. It was in the knowledge that sometimes the best things come from the worst circumstances, and that courage and compassion can change the entire trajectory of a life. Victoria had run from one man and found another who gave her not just protection but partnership, not just safety but love. Yates had offered marriage to save a stranger and discovered his soulmate. Together, they had proven that families can be built on faith as much as blood, that love can grow from the smallest seeds, and that sometimes the universe conspires to put exactly the right people in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Their love story was not one of love at first sight or grand romantic gestures, though there had been elements of both. It was a love story built on respect and kindness, on shared work and shared dreams, on the 1,000 small choices to keep choosing each other day after day, year after year. It was a love story that began with a desperate bargain and became something neither of them could have imagined, something precious and enduring and absolutely real. And so, in the end, the girl who fled to Fort Garland to escape a cruel uncle's schemes found not just safety but joy. The cowboy who offered his name to a stranger found not just a wife but a partner for life. Together, they built a legacy of love that would echo through generations, a testament to the power of courage, compassion, and two hearts brave enough to take a chance on each other when it mattered most. Their story was complete, a circle closed, a promise kept. Victoria had been claimed not by her cruel uncle but by a cowboy with kind eyes and a generous heart. Yates had married her to keep her safe, and in doing so had found his own salvation. They had loved each other truly and deeply for the rest of their days, and when they were gone, they left behind a family, a ranch, and a story that proved love can bloom even in the hardest soil, if only someone is brave enough to plant the seed and patient enough to tend it as it grows.